I want to thank you for coming to this next session of Genesis 1 through 11 series. We have correlated some of the concepts of science with the scriptures, showing that not only are not in conflict, they explain some of what science holds to so dearly. But we're going to find out also in the scriptures that there's a correlation not only with science, but with history itself. It corresponds back in, as Mike had brought out, with what really took place in history, and more recent history, in fact. The interesting thing about the Genesis account is it brings the creation very close to us, within 7,000 years, so that we are actually linked back to Adam and Eve and to the very creation itself a very short amount of time ago, instead of these long periods of time that most of us have in our minds of thinking, oh, this is billions of years, and oh, the evolution took place, and these Adam and Eve were people that arose with some intelligence and things like that. So we're going to go back and show that this thing ties together back with history as well. And one of the keys to this has to do with the genealogies that are given in the book of Genesis, which at the very beginning are very exact on the timing, so that we know how many years these things took place. We don't have time to get into it, but tied into the scriptures are things that are very interesting, like archaeology, geography, so that the places that these things took place. Most religious documents that are held in the world religions have no tie back to geography. You can't find the locations of these places. They're not fixed, and the people are not fixed. They're kind of hung up there in space, with no history, no events, no geography. And in Genesis, it's interesting, and we're going to see this a little bit later, is that the places that are named there before the division into the languages all are in a Semitic language. The places that at the time of Adam, all the way to Noah, are names that are Semitic, and that the original language that people spoke was probably a Semitic-based language, maybe even Hebrew itself. But let's go back and look at the correlations that we have in Genesis 5 and 11. This is the chronology of the Old Testament, particularly using the genealogies and covenants. We've seen in the unity of science and scriptures, the two laws come from the creation and the fall, two historical events in Genesis 1 and 3. Astronomy, which we haven't gotten into, declares that, and this comes from the creation, the omnipotence, that means the all-powerfulness. Omniscience means the all-knowing or knowledge of things. And omnipresence means being in every part of the whole universe at the same time, the infinity of God. And we understand this by the celestial bodies, the greatness of the universe. And it takes some really tough understanding to understand how big the universe is. And people say, well, how can you determine that? I said, well, you look out with a telescope and something takes up so much of your telescope, field, what they call a field of vision, and if you know what your magnification is, if it takes up that much, you can determine how far you are away from that object. For instance, if I see two galaxies, and galaxies have a pretty good average between them, with 400 billion you can get a statistical average. If I see one that's smaller, half the size of another one, I know it's twice the distance away. And that's when we saw them disappearing into the distance. You're reaching out there. And there's no way with the Big Bang Theory that those things could travel out to that distance, even traveling at the speed of light, relativistic speeds, and then send light back to us in less than 30 billion years, traveling at Einstein's speed. It's impossible. They'd be dead by that time anyway. You think we've got problems? This cosmology of naturalism, it's fraught with major problems. But in astronomy, we see this all-powerfulness of God. We see His great wisdom in creating all these things. And we see His omnipresence to be able to reach to all those places that no natural agent can do. In biology, we see His omniscience and infinite wisdom of God in creating human life. And we're just starting to understand that with the genetics. It's caused men that were the world's most, well, I'd say, profound atheists like Anthony Flew saying, becoming a theist, and he says, there's no way this thing happened by time and chance. As we're understanding what operates living systems, it is incredible. It's mind-boggling. And there's no way that you can't even form by time and chance one protein molecule in the whole universe by time and chance. It'll never happen. We see in geology, when you look at these rocks and sedimentary layers that are most of what's on the surface of the earth, what does that reveal to you? A slow process, quiet earth? No, these are catastrophic events, and they're from God's judgment by a worldwide flood with tectonic, meteorological, and hydraulic effects. We're looking at catastrophism when we look at the world around. Sure, it's calm now, but that isn't what formed those things. We can have a major flood today, and you won't find any remnants of living fossils or things that could become fossils in them. Almost none. Very few trees or animals in them. And yet you go out there in the rocks, and there are just billions of them in almost any piece you pick up. What does it tell you about chemistry? It reveals the genius of God as seen in the periodic table of elements and the intricacies of chemicals. Do you know I can give you free electrons and free protons, and you can't produce one carbon atom out of it? Put them together for me. We can tear them apart. But there's no laboratory in the world that can create one atom, complex atom. And yet the whole universe is made out of them? Such genius. Unbelievable genius. Physics, it declares the infinite power and infinitesimal design of God in supergalactic and subatomic structures, as we mentioned. Who could have designed these things so that they work the way they do? And who could have made the periodic table? It's incredible. We don't even understand how it fits together. We've been studying and we know a lot of things, but we can't even come up with a model that fits the laws of electromagnetism that this thing works. They create what they call the strong force, nuclear force, and the weak one. You say, what's that? There's no experimental data or evidence for any of that stuff. We just know that something keeps those protons in the middle of the nucleus that want to blow the thing apart. But you can't test for it. It's only a hypothesis. And yet the whole universe is made out of atoms? It's incredible. And why are there an equal amount of electrons and protons? Why? What would make an equal amount of these? And what would create them out of nothing? So you see in physics, as we've seen here, and that goes from subatomic particles to the supergalactic systems. And they're all in perfect on stable orbits largely. And as I mentioned before, we cannot put something in orbit and then get it to stay there. We put 10,000 things up and they come down, and yet you put a whole universe into orbit? In fact, we cannot even put a 10-body system in orbit and get it to work. And yet our solar system has what? 100 major moons and planets? Try and set those in orbit and expect them to be stable afterwards. You've got to get the right speed in the right altitude to keep it there. Either it goes off or it comes down. And you got a whole universe made out of these? Genesis 1-11 is the apex because it explains everything of harmony between science and the scriptures. Without them, you don't understand anything, and you can't explain anything. Science becomes mindless. The New Testament, let's look at we talked about the scientific unity, now let's look at the historical unity. And we're going to talk about the internal structure of the scriptures themselves. The New Testament assumes the historicity of the Old Testament. The genealogies of Matthew and Luke at the beginning of the New Testament are the same as in Genesis with only minor exceptions. Jesus treats the events in Genesis and the Old Testament as historical. The creation he talks about. Adam, marriage, Abraham, Jonah, Elijah, Moses, David. He treats them as historical. These aren't myths or made-up stories. New Testament Gospels, you got 4 of them. And they assume that the events and prophecies of the Old Testament are real history. Peter, he treats the Old Testament people and events as history. Enoch, Lot, Moses, Elijah, Noah. John, the Apostle John, writes of people and events in the Old Testament as true history. Paul, he builds his theology on historical people and events. Adam, whereas sin entered the world through one man and death through sin in Romans 5, so in the second Adam, he gives life. So he's building his theology of redemption on this. The creation. Oh, from the beginning of creation, he says, it was not so. He made a man and a woman. The man should leave his father and mother, cleave to a woman, and the two become one flesh. Abraham, Jacob, Esau, Moses, David. He treats them all as and builds his theology on these individuals as historical. James, the apostle, commends the actions of how we should act based on historical people and events, like Elijah praying, because he says, pray, just like Elijah. He was of like manner as we are. And he prayed for 3 years and it didn't rain, 3.5 years and it didn't rain. Jude, he builds his whole book on Old Testament events, the flood, angels, Enoch. The New Testament always assumes literal historicity of Old Testament events and people. Biblical chronology, that means the events that take place in the Bible. And why is that important? One, it gives a historical unity to the whole Scriptures. It takes you from Adam to the final consummation of history. You have God's plan of the ages. And as we said, God has purposes in history from the creation. And you have covenants that take place in time that he deals with men, bringing this process from a lost estate back to a redeemed state in the end, and a new heavens and a new earth. You have a scientific and historical time frames for things to take place. These are all tied together, as we've seen. The science is tied into historical events. And the history is very important, and it's tied also to these covenants, the way God works in time and space, bringing about his plans. He's given a purpose. He didn't create this universe and us as a game. He has definite purposes, and he has definite purposes for everyone that exists in history. Hermeneutics. What's hermeneutics? Hermeneutics is a method of interpretation. What this chronology does is it gives us what we call a historical, that means fixed in history, grammatical, in other words, the structure of the text of the Scriptures, and it ties it together so you can interpret the Scriptures. For instance, you have historical narratives. Those are telling history. You have prophecies. They tell of the future. You have poetry. You have different types, wisdom literature and doctrine of how to live. These are all tied together, and they change. He changes some of the rules as he gains, and this is what we call progressive revelation toward the end. And it has purpose, so that you know how to take a passage and how it gives it meaning. Without this, the chronology and history, you don't understand this. In other words, you'll take the book, say this Genesis 1 through 3, and you say, oh, that's myth. Or this is written in poetry. And you say, no, that's historical narrative. You have the same creation account in Psalms 104, and what is it? It's in poetry at that. And you can see the difference. That's why you have some of the same events put into different literature types so we know how to understand them. God didn't give us this thing to get us confused. He made it so we can understand very clearly. And you don't have to be a genius. He made it so that the most simple person can understand it. But it's all based on a time frame, the time.